Welcome to my YouTube channel. Today's story is an intense battle of survival and strategy in Earth's ruthless jungles. If you enjoyed it, please like, share, and subscribe for more epic sci-fi stories. The jungle was alive, thick with heat, humming with unseen predators, and cloaked in perpetual shadow. It wrapped around the invading Zorak forces like a coiled serpent. The alien soldiers marched in rigid formation, their heavy exosuits whirring as they forced their way through tangled vines and thick undergrowth. Their leader, Commander Voxel, glanced around, his mandibles clicking in irritation. "Primitive," he muttered in his guttural tongue. The humans had fled their settlements, retreating into this forsaken wilderness. It would be a simple sweep, burn them out, crush any resistance, and claim this region for the Dominion. 100 pairs of glowing blue eyes scanned the jungle ahead, their vision augmented by scanning arrays. Still, something felt wrong. Voxel paused. The jungle had fallen silent. No insects, no distant growls, nothing but the muffled sounds of his own warriors trudging forward. Then the first explosion ripped through their ranks. A thunderous detonation sent shrapnel and dirt skyward, throwing armored bodies into the trees. Screams, high-pitched, warbling cries of the wounded, echoed through the jungle. Voxel spun, barking orders, but before his troops could regroup, a second blast followed, then a third. The air filled with fire and confusion. From the shadows, unseen eyes watched. Captain Cole Reaper, Harrison kept his breath steady as he observed through the scope of his suppressed rifle. The initial strike had been surgical, well-placed explosives catching the Zorak at their most vulnerable. But the real hunt was just beginning. "Phase 1 complete," murmured Sergeant Miguel, Ghost Ramirez, barely audible through the comms. His face, streaked with jungle mud, blended perfectly into the foliage. Reaper pressed a finger to his earpiece. "Initiate the funnel." 100 yards away, Staff Sergeant Jake, Hawk, Lawson, and Sergeant Anthony Boomer Jackson sprang into action. Hawk's sniper rifle coughed, a silent shot, barely more than a whisper. One of the Zorak officers crumpled, a dark hole where his visor had been. The remaining aliens panicked, firing blindly into the trees, plasma bolts searing through the leaves, but hitting nothing. Boomer, crouched behind a fallen log, grinned as he triggered a secondary charge. A concealed pit suddenly erupted, swallowing a squad of Zorak whole. Their armor clattered as they tumbled, impaled on carefully sharpened wooden stakes. Voxel's panic turned to rage. "Cowards," he roared, his voice amplified by his suit. "Face us in battle." The jungle responded with silence. Then, from behind him, something moved. Too late, he turned, just in time to see a shadow drop from the trees. Ghost struck like a wraith, his knife slicing through the alien's throat in a single, fluid motion. Voxel gurgled, eyes wide, as the Special Jungle Forces soldier eased his body to the ground without a sound. The Zorak ranks were in disarray. Their advanced armor, their superior numbers, none of it mattered. They had stepped into a battlefield they didn't understand, facing an enemy who had made the jungle their ally. "Reaper, this is Mutt," came a voice through the comms. Corporal David, Mutt Taylor, had been monitoring enemy signals from a hidden uplink. "Intercepted a transmission. More Zorak squads inbound. They think we're a small guerrilla group. No idea they just walked into hell." Reaper smiled grimly. "Good. Let's keep it that way." The SJF didn't fight like a conventional military unit. They didn't hold ground, didn't engage in direct combat unless necessary. The jungle was their weapon, and they wielded it with terrifying precision. "Time for extraction," Reaper said. "Ghost, clean up. Hawk, watch our backs. Boomer, leave them a surprise." The team melted into the foliage, as if they had never been there. Behind them, the Zorak were left reeling, their fallen officers sprawled in the mud, their forces scattered. Then, just as they began to recover, the final explosion went off. A cascade of fire ripped through their formation, igniting the jungle in a controlled blaze. By the time the smoke cleared, the humans were gone. But the message had been delivered. The jungle was not theirs to take. The jungle had swallowed them whole. The Zorak forces, once an impenetrable wave of conquest, now moved in scattered, wary clusters, their luminous blue eyes darting between the shadows. Their formation was broken, their cohesion unraveling, and their confidence, the arrogance that had brought them to this planet, had begun to rot under the thick canopy of Earth's untamed wilderness. Reaper watched through his binoculars, lying prone in the undergrowth. He could smell the damp earth, feel the steady thrum of the rainforest around him. The aliens were adjusting, trying to adapt, but they were slow. Slower than fear. Slower than the creeping knowledge that something unseen was hunting them. "They're changing tactics," came Mutt's voice over the comms, quiet but sure. "Heat signatures show them spreading out. Not sticking to a column anymore." "They think it'll stop us from picking them off one by one," Hawk muttered, adjusting the scope of his rifle. He exhaled, waiting. "They're wrong." Across the battlefield, Voktal struggled to restore order. He had abandoned his ceremonial cape, its tattered remains caught on a broken branch somewhere in the jungle's depths. His once pristine exosuit was coated in mud, his blade dull from hacking through vines that refused to part. The jungle was unnatural. No, it was too natural, too alive, and it suffocated his warriors. "Continue forward," he barked in his native tongue, pushing a trembling soldier ahead of him. "Keep moving." They obeyed, but their once proud march had become a wary crawl. Then the whispers started. Not human voices. Not in any language they could understand. Just the jungle itself, speaking in its ancient, quiet way. The rustle of leaves that should not be moving. The click of insects that stopped the moment one turned to listen. The chirping of birds that never seemed to settle in one place. And then the screams. It started with the rear patrol. One moment they were there, rifles sweeping the trees, the next two were gone. No plasma fire, no sound of a struggle. Just the wet slap of something being dragged into the undergrowth. The others barely had time to react before the darkness came alive again. Ghost moved like his namesake, a shadow against shadows. He had spent his life in jungles, from the thick, humid trails of Panama to the emerald labyrinth of Thailand. To him, this battlefield was not alien, it was home. His knife, wrapped in cloth to avoid the glint of metal, worked quickly. The aliens never had a chance to scream. Reaper heard the telltale rustle in the comms, Ghost's signal that his work was done. Another squad down. "They're starting to panic," Mutt reported. "I'm tapping into their comms. Their commander's losing his grip." "Good," Reaper replied. "Let's make sure he doesn't get it back." Boomer and Hawk had already moved ahead, setting the next phase into motion. This was where the war changed. The aliens were learning that brute force would not save them. But humans? Humans adapted. They turned weakness into strength. Boomer's traps were not just crude explosives. They were psychological warfare. The Zorak had never faced an enemy that didn't fight face to face. They had never fought soldiers who would let them walk into their own deaths, never hearing the tripwire until it was too late. The first went off in the center of the formation. A controlled blast, just enough to send bodies flying, but not enough to kill them all. That wasn't the point. The real damage came afterward. Voktal rose from the dirt, his ears ringing, his HUD flickering with static. He could hear the wounded, the scattered cries of warriors who had never known fear before today. His vision cleared just in time to see something else, something worse. His own warriors, firing at one another. The humans had set up decoys, holographic projectors repurposed from stolen Zorak tech. They flickered to life in the chaos, shimmering figures of human soldiers appearing between the trees. The aliens panicked, firing wildly. Some of the projected images staggered, as if hit, before vanishing into nothingness. But the real humans, they remained unseen, watching as their enemy thinned its own ranks. Reaper smirked. "Mutt, keep scrambling their frequencies. Let's keep the confusion going." "Already on it," Mutt said. "They're about to start shooting at shadows." It didn't take long. Paranoia took root in the surviving squads. When a real human finally moved, a blur in the darkness, plasma fire erupted in all directions. Ghost chuckled lowly. "They're starting to see monsters where there are none." The Zorak were learning, but too slowly. For every step they took toward adapting, the humans were 3 steps ahead. Voktal could feel it slipping. His command, his army, his mind. They had come expecting war. This was something else. This was the death of reason. And then the laughter. A deep, echoing sound distorted through the trees, bouncing off the thick trunks, moving as if it had no source. Reaper's voice, fed through Mutt's signal modulator, warping across enemy comms and back into the air. "You don't belong here," it whispered in the alien tongue. "You're prey now." The silence that followed was heavier than the humid air. Then Hawk took his shot. One clean kill, right through the skull of an officer who had barely begun to turn toward the sound. Another explosion. Another scream. Another body vanishing into the shadows. The jungle belonged to them now. Vaktal's breath came in ragged bursts. His exosuit, designed for battlefield superiority, was failing him here. Its servos, so effective in open terrain, whined in protest against the endless tangles of vines and roots. The weight of his armor, once a symbol of his dominance, had become a prison in this suffocating green abyss. Around him, his warriors, what remained of them, moved with uneasy, frantic energy. They flinched at every rustling leaf, every whisper of wind. Their once flawless formations had collapsed into clumsy, desperate clusters, weapons twitching at shadows. They were breaking. The jungle had turned against them, and the humans were the ones pulling the strings. Reaper crouched in the dense foliage, watching the aliens stumble forward. They still had numbers, still had firepower, but none of it mattered. They were rattled. He could see it in the way they gripped their weapons too tightly, in the way their heads jerked at every phantom sound. They had abandoned their pride, their discipline. They were fighting blind now, trapped in a war they didn't understand. A whisper crackled through his earpiece. "They're heading for the river." Mutt's voice was steady, calm. "Probably think open ground will save them." Reaper smirked. "Let's show them how wrong they are." Ghost moved first. He was the silent blade in the dark, the thing the Zorak feared but could never see. He flitted through the trees, slipping between the broad leaves, his footsteps swallowed by the soft, damp earth. His knife flashed once, a quick, clean cut through an exposed throat, before he vanished again. The alien's body collapsed into the mud with a wet thud, unnoticed by his panicked squad mates. Further ahead, Hawk was already in position. His rifle, modified with a stolen Zorak scope, gave him a perfect view of their ragged procession. He exhaled, lined up his shot, and squeezed the trigger. The lead officer's head snapped back, a single hole where his eye had been. The aliens barely had time to register the kill before another body dropped. Then another. The jungle erupted in chaos. Boomer was waiting for this moment. His traps had been set hours ago, tripwires rigged with explosives, pressure plates buried under the wet leaves. The first blast sent a Zorak warrior flying into the underbrush, armor shattered, limbs twisted. Another stepped back in fear, only to trigger a secondary charge. Fire and dirt filled the air, the shockwaves shaking the canopy above. Screams followed, sharp and desperate. The survivors turned on each other, weapons swinging wildly, eyes darting to every shadow. Mutt's voice cut through the comms. "Interference is holding. They're completely blind." Reaper didn't need to hear the rest. He could see it. The Zorak were stumbling now, reduced to prey fleeing a predator they couldn't comprehend. Vaktal, covered in mud, and the blood of his own kind, gritted his teeth. This was impossible. His warriors were elite, his technology unmatched. And yet, here they were, dying in the dark, cut down by an enemy they couldn't even find. "We moved to the river," he snarled into his communicator. "Now." But the moment they reached the water's edge, the trap closed. A sudden, blinding flash detonated among them, an EMP charge, handcrafted by Boomer, designed to overload their suits. The effect was immediate. The remaining Zorak staggered as their HUDs flickered, their enhanced reflexes cut in half. Power cores stuttered, limbs locked, targeting systems scrambled. And then the humans came. Reaper and Ghost struck first, slipping through the chaos like wraiths, cutting down soldiers before they could react. Hawk's rifle spoke again, each shot precise, each kill clean. Boomer unleashed hell, tossing grenades with a grin, watching as the explosions tore through whatever order the Zorak had left. Mutt, hidden nearby, tapped into their failing systems, feeding them false signals, making them see enemies where there were none. It was over before it even began. Vaktal fell to his knees, his suit's power drained, his warriors slaughtered around him. His mandibles twitched, his breath shallow. He had led them here. He had believed in their superiority. And he had been wrong. Reaper stood over him, rifle aimed. "You never had a chance." Vaktal looked up, eyes burning with hate. This world, he spat, coughing up thick, blue blood. This jungle, it fights for you. Reaper's expression was unreadable. No, he said quietly. We became the jungle. And then he pulled the trigger. The jungle had reclaimed its silence. Smoke curled lazily through the humid air, drifting above the shattered remains of the Zorak forces. The bodies lay where they had fallen, some half buried in the mud, others slumped against the gnarled roots of ancient trees. Their luminous blue blood soaked into the earth, mingling with the damp decay of the rainforest. Reaper lowered his rifle, exhaling slowly. His team emerged from the foliage, spectral figures blending seamlessly with their surroundings. The battle had ended, but their work was not finished. Mutt crouched over one of the fallen aliens, flipping open a damaged wrist console. The display flickered weakly, cycling through distorted glyphs. He pulled a small device from his belt and connected it. They sent out a distress call before they went down, he muttered. Encrypted but not complicated. Hawk wiped sweat from his brow, glancing up at the dense canopy. Means reinforcements. His voice was steady, but there was no mistaking the edge beneath it. Reaper nodded. How long? Mutt's fingers danced over his device, decrypting the signal. Judging by the pulse delay, 3 hours, maybe less. Boomer gave a low whistle. That's not much time to set up a welcome party. Ghost, crouched near the riverbank, let a handful of wet earth slip through his fingers. We don't need a welcome party. His voice was calm, matter-of-fact. We need to disappear. Reaper looked over the battlefield. They had shattered the Zorak's first wave, broken their will, made them bleed. But a second force would come, one better prepared, one that wouldn't march blindly into the jungle's grasp. We've made our point, he said, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. Now we remind them that ghosts don't leave tracks. The team moved efficiently, stripping the battlefield of anything that could be used against them. They scavenged ammunition, retrieved spent casings, and burned anything that bore their marks. Bodies were left as they were. The jungle would take care of them soon enough. Hawk retrieved his sniper casing from the base of a thick tree and crushed it beneath his boot. What about him? He nodded toward Voxel's corpse, his armor blackened from Reaper's final shot. Reaper stared down at the lifeless Zorak commander. There was no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction. Just the quiet weight of inevitability. Let them find him, he said finally. Let them see what happens to those who think they own this place. Ghost knelt beside the body, pressing a palm into the mud. When he lifted it, a perfect handprint remained, one that would fade within hours, swallowed by the ever-hungry rainforest. They'll come looking for us, Mutt murmured, adjusting his gear. Reaper glanced at him, a hint of a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. Let them. The special jungle forces vanished as they had come, leaving behind only the ruins of arrogance and the quiet song of the jungle reclaiming its own.